Hi, welcome back to Existential Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the first one in a relatively short series that'll introduce our topic matter for the entire semester, which of course has to do with existentialism and what existentialism has to say with respect to the project of psychology. The first mass of material for this semester takes the form of a set of notes that I wrote for you, which will more or less occupy us for the next 4 or 5 videos. And strategically, the idea there is to get you thinking about existentialism, what it is and what it is not, in a way that will help you understand the very first book for this semester, which will be Rollo May's The Discovery of Being, but also strategically it gives you some time to order that book or the books for the entire semester for that matter off the internet, which is where you can get the best prices for them. So I suggest that you at least get Rollo May's The Discovery of Being, because once we get done this short set of videos, we'll be digging into that. But at any rate, like I said, the topic for this particular video has to do with introducing you to existentialism. But before we launch into that, a couple little sartorial items, as it were. And the first is to get my professorial hair under control a little bit with this hat. Okay, it's a little bit hard to find haircuts in the midst of the corona vortex, so here's my way of trying to keep my unruly hair under control. This next sartorial item has to do with my shirt. Today happens to be Father's Day, so I received a shirt this morning, and here's the shirt. I tell dad jokes periodically. Okay, items from the periodic table. Get it? Okay, so that might be a warning, actually, for you with regard to, I suppose, my style in presenting material. And it's important that you get a warning before the drop ad period ends, because if you don't like to have a good time, you're probably going to be miserable in this class, because personally I like to have a good time in life, in my work too. So there's a warning. You have been warned. All right, so let's take a look at the notes for the first series of videos. So it's Existential Psychology, Getting Started. So I wrote a bunch of pages for you entitled Getting Started. And here's the basic strategy behind this packet of notes. I want to explore existentialism in a very loose and approximate way by looking at what I think would be a typical everyday understanding of what existentialism is. So one way I like to have about thinking about this is like if you were to go and take a survey of just everyday people, like let's say you went down to Walmart or somewhere like that and just started taking, clipboard. Oh, I've got a clipboard. I've got a prop. You started like taking a survey of different people and asking them, like, how do you conceive the fundamental nature of existential thought? And just sort of wrote down whatever it is they'd say. I bet that their answers would converge on something like this in fairly short order. Well, it's a somewhat gloomy, atheistic, and individualistic philosophy of existence, isn't it? Something like that. And so I want to start with that, more or less what I think of as kind of an everyday way of thinking about existentialism and unpacking it, talking about the ways in which that characterization is true and talking about ways in which it is not true. So this next series of videos is going to be more or less structured about that, like that. So I'm going to sort of take that sentence apart. Let me just sort of reread it just so you have the idea. A somewhat gloomy, atheistic and individualistic philosophy of existence. Okay, so we're going to be unpacking that. So today what we're going to be doing is asking the question, is existentialism about existence? And then sort of in the latter half of the video, I want to talk a little bit about the interrelationship between existentialism and phenomenology, which is a mode of inquiry that maybe you've heard about a little bit. If you're in the program here at West Georgia, you've been here for a little while, odds are you've heard about it. But I want to unpack the interrelationship between those two and characterize what both of them are. So, is existentialism about existence? First question. And I gave you the answer. Spoilers, yes and no. Actually, all of these questions are going to have yes and no answers. Okay, so it is about existence. In fact, existentialism kind of has the word existence already embedded in it, if you think about it. So it is about existence, but it's existence thought in a somewhat specialized way. And it's not necessarily going to be the common everyday way that we have of thinking about existence. Like, the common everyday way would be something like, well, when does something exist? Well, something exists if it's in the world, if it's in reality. And if you ask a deeper question, well, how do you know if something's in reality or not? More or less, I think the everyday answer would be like, well, you know, if you can kick it, then it's there. In other words, if you can sort of apprehend it by way of your senses, then it must exist. So existentialism is going to try to be thinking the meaning of existence in a much deeper way than that. That it's not just that something exists when it's contained within sort of the huge cosmic bucket that we call the universe. If something's in there, then it exists. So it's going to be trying to think the meaning of the word existence in a much deeper way than that. And here I want to point to something that you'll probably encounter early in your Rollo May reading, okay, when we get to that book. And it's the fact that often enough, these existential writers will write the word existence in sort of odd ways. They look like typographical errors, actually, when you encounter them. For instance, in your Rollo May book, he writes it like I have there in bold letters in your notes, E-K-SIS-T-E-N-C-E, existence, in an odd way. And then there's another one. This one comes to us by way of another existential thinker, Jaspers. Okay, so existence with a Z at the end, as though that might clarify. So the obvious question when you encounter these things is, what are they trying to say with these kind of weird ways of spelling the word existence? Well, what they're trying to do is they're trying to dislodge you and me, the readers, from our normal everyday sense of what existence is. So, and like I said, the normal everyday sense is more or less goes like this. It's like the universe is a big bucket. If something has been plunked into it, then we say that it exists. So they're trying to sort of invite us to question that by spelling the word existence in a weird way. You know, they're already trying to sort of dislodge us, as it were, from our normal everyday idea about what existence is. Okay, so what kind of, aside from dislodging us, what else are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to evoke a more etymological sense for what existence means. Okay, so etymology, in case you don't know that word, has to do with how words evolve over time. Like how words, let's say in English, derive from much older words in other languages, and the most common other language for the English language would be Latin. Okay, so I read one time that I think about 60% of our words in English come from Latin, and there's a certain fraction that come from Greek and, you know, even other languages. But what they're trying to do is trying to evoke the etymological, historical sense for the word existence as a way of trying to get at a much more fundamental and radical understanding for what the word even means. So what I did for you in your notes is I traced out some of the etymological lineage, the historical lineage of the word existence. So we get it by way of medieval Latin existere, which basically just means to exist. So medieval Latin, okay. And then, of course, classical Latin, which preceded medieval Latin by probably 1,000 years or more, comes from two words. Ex is a preposition that means out from, basically, and stare is a sto stare steady status in classical Latin means to stand. Okay, so basically, if you put those two together, what it means is a kind of standing out from. Okay, a kind of standing out. And it may seem like, oh my goodness, like what an odd thing. And then to sort of give you even a deeper sense for the etymological meaning of the word existence, I gave it to you in Greek. So ek in Greek, and then stasis is how you say that Greek word that I have there in your notes. But it basically means, once again, to stand out. So when these existential writers are writing the word existence in odd ways, part of what they're trying to do is first trying to deflect us away from our normal everyday understanding of what that word means, and second, trying to evoke a much deeper sense for what it means in terms of the words etymological roots, to stand out. Okay, so what does that mean? How does that get at a deeper sense for the word existence? So a couple different ways. First of all, a standing out is meant to suggest an active, dynamic process. Okay, I was silent there because that should be a dramatic moment, all right? So more silence, more drama. Okay, that might be a slight dad joke there, I'm not sure. So thinking of standing out as an active, ongoing dynamism rather than something like a static idea about existence, kind of like I was saying, like, well, you know, the universe is a big bucket, and if whatever's dropped into the bucket exists. That's a much more static way of thinking about existence, but a much more dynamic, process-oriented would be that it's an ongoing unfolding over time. You getting it? An ongoing unfolding over time, that's really what the deeper meaning of existence is. So I said a second ago there are going to be a couple meanings to that. That's the first one. So an active process involving an integral relation to world. Okay, so it's a standing out where? In the world. Okay, so in other words, the implication here is that what the world is integral to what we are. What we are is integral to what the world is. Or if you want sort of a bigger, more encompassing word, the universe or something like that. So what the universe is an integrally unfolding active process with respect to what we are. What we are is an integrally unfolding active process with respect to what the universe is, and it unfolds over time. So it's a kind of standing out in the world. It's also a kind of standing out with respect to time, too. All right? So, and hopefully you're starting to get a sense that, wow, this probably wouldn't be the definition that most people would give at Walmart. Once again, oh, I love to use my props. You know, if you went around in Walmart and asked people, like, you know, how do you conceive of the fundamental nature of existence? That's probably not, the existential rendering is probably not the average answer you would get. Well, you know, I conceive it in terms of a fundamental dynamism between ourselves and the universe, where it unfolds with respect to time, a kind of standing out in the universe, also a kind of temporal standing out. That probably would not be the most common answer. Unless I happen to be shopping at Walmart, you probably wouldn't even get it. One of your fellow students, possibly. So this is a way of thinking of existence in holistic terms, okay? So holism. Okay, so what is holism? So holism is thinking about all of what we are in terms of all of what is. All right, that would be sort of a real short way of glossing it. Thinking about us as whole, entire beings who are inhabiting lives in terms of the large overarching context of the universe. So thinking about all of what we are in terms of all of what is. So this weird spelling of the word existence is meant to get at that. So, okay, so a standing out in that particular way. All right, now I gave you an example here, and this example is one you're going to find in the Rollo-May book when you get into that. And okay, there's a few German vocabulary words there, because Rollo-May is borrowing some vocabulary from a German philosopher that we'll talk about later in the semester, whose name is Martin Heidegger. All right, so Rollo-May quoting Martin Heidegger and taking some of his vocabulary, and this is going to be an example of thinking of existence in this particular standing out etymological type way. All right, so Dasein, so Heidegger thinks of existence or being in terms of Dasein, which means literally in German, sein means to be, it's the verb to be, and da means there. So to be there, to be in the world, okay, to stand out in the world. And hopefully I'm trying to connect the dots here for you for a second, that you can see, wow, this is sort of the same thing that we just got done talking about. Yeah, you are incredibly perceptive. Glad you're learning. Okay, so Dasein, or being in the world, is an example of thinking of existence in this way, and I broke it down for you a little bit more. So in terms of Heidegger's analysis, there are three interrelated dimensions. The Umwelt, in German, Umwelt means, well, Welt means world, and sort of means like surrounding. And kind of here, what the Umwelt is getting at is the world of sort of surrounding world, as it were, of inanimate objects. and stuff like that. So that's part of existence. The Mitwelt, mit in German means with, all right? And Welt once again means world. So the with world, as it were, okay, what is this getting at? This is the world of other people, sociality, culture, interpersonal relations, and so on. And finally, the Eigenwelt. So one's own, or the one world, one's own world, let's say. And this is meant to get at the world of your interiority and subjectivity. All right, so all three of these dimensions are interwoven and constantly influencing one another. So Umwelt, Mitwelt, and Eigenwelt braiding together as a way of characterizing Dasein, or being in the world. So this is, what's the point of this? The point is to exemplify this specialized sense of the word existence. Okay, it's one way of thinking it through. There are other ways. When we encounter other existential thinkers, you'll hear about other ways. Okay. So the other point about this has to do with the Eigenwelt, all right? So, by the way, if you studied, sort of higher mathematics, like eigenvectors, same etymological Germanic root, all right? So eigenstates and eigenvectors, and that's if you studied math, God, when I was young, I was so in love with math, and maybe some of you were too. At any rate, the Eigenwelt has to do with the sub-element of subjectivity, okay? So it's not just that there's this universe of inanimate surrounding objects. It's not just that there's also this social, interpersonal, cultural type context. There's also the element of subjectivity. Now, the element of subjectivity, the implication, is going to have to do with why there's such a natural overlap between existentialism and phenomenology. Okay, so to illustrate this overlap, what you ought to do is go to the last page of your notes packet, and I'm going to put it up here right next to me on your YouTube video, wherein, it's the last page of this packet, there's a Venn diagram that looks something like this. Such drama. Okay, so a simple Venn diagram. So that left circle is meant to represent phenomenology, which is going to be a movement in philosophy, okay, that's going to intersect with existentialism. So the rightmost circle represents existentialism. And since these circles are overlapping like that, right, that sort of prefigures three distinct regions, okay? One of them that's going to be phenomenological, but not yet existential. The other of which will be existential, but not yet phenomenological. And then there's going to be a region where they overlap. And so it's going to be both existential and phenomenological. And what I've done here, besides put that Venn diagram up there, is I tried to sort out some of the names you'll be hearing this semester, and probably names if you're in the department you've already heard. So Edmund Husserl is going to be the great progenitor of pure or transcendental phenomenology, and what that is we'll characterize in a second. Three more names in the middle section where they overlap. So Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Martin Heidegger, whose name I just got done mentioning. You might infer that he's a big deal, and he is. Jean-Paul Sartre, French thinker. And finally, all the way on the right, in what I'm calling literary existentialism, I put Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Albert Camus, Martin Buber, Franz Kafka, and there are numerous others that could be fit into this Venn diagram. But I sort of put the names up there that I think would be the most common ones for you to encounter, because I don't want to sort of overload you on the first content-driven day of class. So you might already be feeling a little bit overloaded. Students often do in this class in the beginning, because they're getting used to something that they're definitely not used to. So if already you feel like, holy crap, I don't know if I'm going to be able to hang on for this ride, well, okay, maybe you will and maybe you won't, but at least hang on a little bit longer to see if you start adapting to it, because very often students are, it feels like astronaut training, like they're blasted back in their chair and there's all this Germanic vocabulary and these quoting Latin words and Greek and all these other languages and weird coinages. And for most students, if you just hang on for the ride, eventually you'll start to get the hang of it, even if you're a little intimidated at first. And speaking of intimidation, these next definitions might have have a element of intimidation to them too. Let me say something about that. I've learned from doing courses like this over the last quarter century. God, did I really say that? Yes, I really said the last quarter century. I'm getting so ancient. My God, I am timeless as the winds themselves. One thing I've learned is that students very often are intimidated, like I said in the beginnings of this class, but the real source of that intimidation is because the workings of phenomenology and existentialism are far more simple than you're used to. Okay, so at first students are intimidated because it seems so damn complicated, you know, with all the specialized vocabulary and etymological understanding of words, blah, 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 you know. But the real root of the difficulty isn't that this stuff is complex. The real root of the difficulty is that it's way simpler than you're used to. And at first that sounds like, probably don't even believe it, but actually it'll turn out to be true. Okay, so let's characterize these three regions of this Venn diagram. Okay, so pure phenomenology, also known as transcendental phenomenology sometimes, but pure phenomenology is probably more common. That's the one associated with Edmund Husserl, and I gave you a rendering of it, and this rendering is probably going to seem a little scary unless you're used to, you know, this kind of talk. So pure phenomenology, it tries to account for the everyday appearance of the world, like how the world appears to us to be the world, by examining acts of consciousness. So one of the central constructs of pure phenomenology is going to be consciousness, and it's going to be trying to account for how it is that we ever get the idea that we're living in a world alongside other people in a universe by looking at what our consciousness is doing, right? So what is our consciousness doing such that we end up construing what it's doing in terms of living lives in this universe, okay? So acts of consciousness, I gave you a good Husserlian, actually Greek word that he appropriates. So noesis, the singular is noesis. So acts of consciousness, what consciousness is doing, and appearances to consciousness. Okay, so the word for that is noema, and the Greek plural is noemata. All right, so how it is that noesis and noemata are corresponding to each other and unfolding over time, such that we end up thinking that you're watching a video, let's say, or that I'm making a video for you. So it looks for the essences of consciousness, right? And what an essence is, in this case, is a necessary and invariant structure. Necessary means it has to be there for this form of consciousness to be what it is, and invariant means it doesn't change into something else, all right? So it's going to be looking for the essences, the necessary and invariant structures of different kinds of consciousness. And an essence, how you know you have an essence, is that it appears within your phenomenological reflective project. What that means, that probably sounds so freaking mysterious to you right now, but it appears in your reflection, like you're wondering about what your consciousness is doing and how things are appearing to your consciousness, ultimately in such a way that you think you're living a life. All right? Of course, normal perceptual consciousness is just one mode of consciousness. So you, from a phenomenological standpoint, you could look at any mode of consciousness. For instance, you could look at dream consciousness and wonder about what makes a dream a dream. What is consciousness doing, and how are things appearing to consciousness? What are the noesis? What are the noemata? Such that you end up thinking that you're dreaming. Or hallucinatory consciousness, okay? What makes having a hallucination? How come you think you're having a hallucination? What is your consciousness doing, and how are things appearing to your consciousness such that you think you're having any kind of consciousness, okay? Abstract thinking consciousness, meditative consciousness, any sort of consciousness, but sort of the most sort of obvious example would be normal consciousness, and your normal consciousness is that you think you're awake, you think you're not meditating, you think you're not hallucinating, and you think you're just sort of moving in your everyday world. All right, so how does the world appear to you to be the world in terms of your consciousness? So an essence appears in your phenomenological reflection in a special moment of intuition and with a quality of certainty, okay? And I give you the fancy word. I won't ask you about this on the test, but in case you're ever on Jeopardy, possibly, you know, apodicticity. So like, I'll take like transcendental phenomenology for 400, please, Alex. And they'll ask you a question about what is the name for the quality of certainty associated with a special moment in phenomenological reflection called intuition? And you would say apodicticity there, Alex. Good, all right. So I gave you sort of the thematic battle cry, as it were, of pure phenomenology. This is from Husserl. He said, back to the things themselves, famously, back to the things themselves. So whenever you encounter this phrase, you know someone's referring to pure phenomenology in Edmund Husserl. But the thing is that that can be so easily misconstrued. So I glossed it a little bit differently in your notes. Back to the things as we experience them, I think would be a much more accurate way of interpreting that. And here, maybe I should, before we move on to existential phenomenology, make note of sort of the central riddle of pure phenomenology and probably of phenomenology in general, and it goes like this. How come you end up being convinced that you're living in a world that has a kind of reality status outside of you, when all the evidence for that external reality status is given to you precisely by way of your internal subjective experience? Sort of a weird thing. Like, how come you ever think that there's a world out there somewhere, or a universe out there somewhere, where all the evidence that would count toward the truth of that statement comes to you in one way or another precisely by way of how you experience things subjectively? How do you ever end up thinking that there's an objective world? Because all the evidence comes to you by way of your subjective experience. So that's, it's a kind of paradoxical riddle, but it's one way of describing what phenomenology wants to do, and more specifically what pure phenomenology wants to do. Okay, so second region, existential phenomenology. This is where phenomenology overlaps with existentialism. Okay, so by the way, when I ask you about this stuff on the test, I'm going to stay pretty close to the descriptions here because they're so tough for students to get a hold of that I'm going to make it a little easier for you, I'm going to stay pretty close to the vocabulary here. So the vocabulary of intuiting essences that we saw in pure phenomenology is going to drop out, and instead there's going to be the vocabulary of something like interpretation and interpreting our pre-reflective everyday experience. Interpreting our everyday experience, how you move through life in the everyday, to get an articulation of its meaning, okay, with respect to the question of existence or being. So interpreting everyday experience to try to get some kind of insight into what it means with respect to what is existence or being about. Okay, so all the talk of essence drops away. Okay, that's pure phenomenon. So on the test, if I ask you blah, 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 essence, probably the answer is going to be something like pure phenomenology. If I ask you on the test, like blah, 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 interpreting everyday experience, probably the answer is going to be existential phenomenology. All right. So unless there's a not in the sentence, which of course inverts the question. So you have to sort of keep track of that. So tries to interpret pre-reflective everyday experience to get an articulation of its meaning with respect to the question of being or existence. No essence here, but an ongoing open-ended interpretation. Okay, here's the fancier word for that. Once again, if you're on Jeopardy, or I don't know, maybe you're just trying to get laid in a bar somewhere, you can use the word hermeneutic to describe this interpretive activity. Okay, so hermeneutics is the sector of philosophy that has to do with the nature of interpretation. Okay, so we'll be interpreting everyday experience, doing a hermeneutic of everyday experience, using your new vocabulary word to get an articulation of its meaning. So open-ended interpretation of experience that sees existence in terms of what we got done describing earlier in the video. Odd how that works, huh? A holistic being in the world. And remember, part of what that means to imply is an ongoing mutual interplay between self, world, and all the beings that inhabit it, everyone else. Okay, all sentient beings, if you like that Buddhist way of talking about it. So that's existential phenomenology. And probably to really understand this, you're probably going to have to think about it a bunch, because when you first hear this vocabulary, it's like, oh my goodness. And finally, the rightmost sector of that Venn diagram has to do with something that I'm calling literary existentialism. Okay, so literary existentialism is not going to be phenomenological in the technical sense, let's put it that way, although you could construe literary existentialism as doing a kind of informal phenomenology. But to make things simpler for you to get on board, believe it or not, you may find it hard to believe that I'm trying to make this as easy as possible for you to get on board, because it gets thick kind of quickly. So literary existentialism is not going to be doing technical phenomenology. It's like, here's one way of telling. It's like when you pick up a book of hardcore technical phenomenology, you know right away that you are reading a dense, hardcore philosophy book. All right? There's not much mistaking. Like if you pick out The Phenomenology of Perception by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, it's like the very first page, you know that what this is going to be about. Okay? So it's dense, it's difficult, it's demanding. When you read a book in literary existentialism, a lot of the time, it's not even necessarily clear that you're reading a philosophy book at all. It's like people start, they start telling stories, it's like, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche, which you'll be reading later in the semester. It's like, well, he introduces this character, Zarathustra, who's been living up on a mountaintop for 10 years with an eagle and a snake, and he comes down after 10 years of solitary, except for his animal's existence, and goes into this town and blah, 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 and encounters different characters, and there's a tightrope walker and blah, blah, and it's, at first it's like, is this like supposed to be philosophy? It sounds like a story in a way. So literary existentialism has that quality. It's a more artistic way, if you want to think about it this way, a more artistic or literary way of getting at existential truths. Okay, so part of what existentialists have realized is that not all powerful insights into the nature of existence come to us by way of fairly technical philosophical activity or technical reflective activity. Sometimes you need a more artistic or literary sensibility to really cut into the fabric of who and what we are as human beings. That sometimes that's a better way. All right, so what are these stories about? Well, they're trying to illuminate the nature of existence, but they're also trying to change our relation to existence. And of course, they're doing it in an artistic way. So I said by dramatically illuminating its basic themes and structures. Okay, so 3 interrelated regions of inquiry. In this class, we're not going to be talking much about the first one, pure phenomenology, although I mentioned a little bit about it, but that's just to sort of set the context for existentialism. We're going to be talking a fair amount about existential phenomenology, that's the middle section, and we're definitely going to be talking a fair amount about literary type existentialism. So this video's already long enough, so that's the first segment. Okay, welcome to the class. I guess this is the first content-driven video, so welcome to the class, and if I didn't scare you off, I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one. Bye-bye.